Welcome to the TIPNG VoteCast. This is a podcast for those interested in the 2022 National General Elections in Papua New Guinea. My name is Yombari Highway. I'm the Deputy Director for Partnerships and Policy with Transparency International PNG. This podcast is brought to you by TIPNG in partnership with the Australian Government under the PNG-Oz partnership. And in this episode, we'll be discussing the National Parliament and the National General Elections. I'm pleased to have a special guest with us on this episode to give us insights into how Parliament works during the lead up to the elections and in the transition into a new government. I'll allow our guest to introduce himself and tell us a bit about what he does.
Thank you, Yombari. My name is Richard Witchchurch. I am the Deputy Clerk, Corporate and Support Services for the National Parliament. I've been there for 27 odd years with the Parliamentary service and in various roles as a junior lawyer, as Chief of Security, to Deputy Parliamentary Counsel, and then eventually Acting Parliamentary Counsel. Last year I was elevated to Deputy Clerk, so I have a little bit of experience in the National Parliament. But before we start this, I'll just let you know that these are primarily my views in this discussion. And they're not necessarily the views of the National Parliament, the Speaker, nor the Clerk, and these come from my own experiences. So,
excellent, and thank you for joining us on this episode. I think this is an episode that our listeners and viewers would be very interested in. We hear a lot about the work of Parliament in the lead up to the elections, and we're pleased to have you on this episode. In terms of the Parliament of Papua New Guinea, maybe you could tell us a bit about its composition, structure, and functions. What does the organization of Parliament look like?
Okay, the National Parliament is a body composed of members of Parliament, and it forms the House, the National Parliament House. The Parliamentary service is the service. It's a separate state service provided by the Constitution, which is the enabling, how should I say it, the body or the service that looks after the legislature, which is the National Parliament. It looks after the building itself, looks after the budgeting, the salaries of the members, and is also included in the parliamentary service such as bodies as the Salaries Remuneration Commission Secretariat, who are the ones that primarily deal with the determinations for leaders. So the National Parliament itself is the body that makes the laws, makes the decisions on the floor of the House, which is broken up into two, the government and the opposition. The parliamentary service is headed by the clerk, but under the direction control of the Speaker. So the service, I work for the service, and we work for the essentially the making sure that the Parliament is up and running smoothly.
Thank you for that explanation. I think for TIPNG, Parliament and National Parliament Services have been a long-standing partner, and we thank the Speaker, obviously, and the Clerk for continuing that partnership. I think most notably, we work together on the Open Parliament project, which is now housed within Parliament as part of the information dissemination services offered by the Parliament. Within Parliament at the moment, what are the different functions that do communicate out with the public, and how do they work together?
Yes, thank you. What we have in relation to information dissemination from the National Parliamentary Service perspective is we have 4 divisions that do work in disseminating information. We have the Parliamentary Media Services, which is a division that is aligned with the Clerk's office. We have the library that comes under my direction, and also the ICT division, and then we have the Civics and Education division, which comes under the Chamber Services division. Those 4 divisions are the ones that we would look towards disseminating information. Civics and Education's component is for practice parliaments, mock parliaments, disseminating general information to schools, having a schools program. That is our primary outreach division. The media services concentrates more on a collaboration and liaison with mainstream media within Papua New Guinea. The library is currently where our website is housed, the server for that. And again, ICT is the division we try to use to make sure that that website its integrity is not compromised in any way, either being hacked or what have you, or continually trying to update that with information.
Yep, and it's an excellent website. I have a vested interest in the TIPNG. I assisted with some of the development behind that website. But for our listeners and viewers, we recommend visiting the Papua New Guinea National Parliament website. That's parliament.gov.pg. It has resources including information about the functions of Parliament, bills and legislative papers, information on members of Parliament in the current session, in the current Parliament, but also, importantly, Parliament sitting dates. And I believe the next Parliament sitting date is next week.
Correct, next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday, and that'll be the final Parliament session.
We're expecting that will be the final one. That's from my information from the clerk, yes.
Excellent. And I think that brings us to why we're having this episode discussion on the TIPNG VoteCast. It is the final session of Parliament, as we understand, because we are leading up to the National General Election, which will commence with the issue of writs on the 24th of April. So this is the commencement of the election period, and often in the lead up to the election, there's a lot of focus in terms of candidates and campaigning, but there's also some functions that the National Parliament caretakes as we lead up to the election and in the formation of the new government. So this is something that we'd like to also discuss, and for our listeners and viewers, go into some of those details. What is the current status in terms of the National Parliament's preparation before the national elections?
Yes, the status is that once the final Parliament session is done, in the lead up prior to that, we've been working hard at getting the various publications that we need before the first sitting of Parliament, trying to square them away. That includes the making sure that all of the legislation and things such as the Constitution, which has had some minor changes as we've trekked along. Since 2017, maybe there's been a constitutional amendment or two that has happened, and we have to make sure that all of those are captured within the Constitution so that that document is up to date, and as we trek into the 11th Parliament, such things as the standing orders which govern how the procedure on the floor of Parliament is done, how meetings are conducted. There's some, we're looking at some of the standing orders to see whether it would be appropriate at this stage to amend them or, change in some small or large way. Again, that is that will be a job that will be decided by the Parliamentary Standing Orders Committee at the opportune time when they can sit down and do that. So we are also preparing for an induction program to be held when the members have come in and have been sworn in as members and then officially assume their office after the first session of Parliament. The second session will be the actual opening, and then we usually have about a week in order to give an induction program for those new members who have never been to Parliament before. And that is basically to run them through their roles, responsibilities, functions, give them some interaction with the departments, the government agencies, constitutional bodies that they will be required to work with essentially as a member of Parliament. So we're in the lead up. That's what the Parliamentary Service is currently doing now.
Yeah. And I think we saw on social media the Parliamentary Services were posting some of the images from the new manual that's being developed, and I guess that will also be launched at that time when you have the induction.
Yes,
services.
correct. We're trying to square away all of these publications so that we're up to date when we get there. My office has been working on the manual for the staff of Parliament, and the reason we're working on that is because from 2017 until 2022 there's been some changes within our own structure, including the creation of Deputy Clerk's office that I'm currently holding. So we're looking at that, as well as having some new staff in our corporate plan manager and director, and a few others. So yeah, that's what the current preparations are.
And I just wanted to pick up on something you mentioned about parliamentary standing orders. If that's something that would be looked at in terms of amendments, will it also have to take place in this forthcoming session, or is that something that usually goes into the next Parliament?
As I said, from my experience, from my understanding of parliamentary practice in other Commonwealth countries, the standing orders are usually looked at by the Parliament on their way out of the door, for fear of having that perception that standing orders were changed to suit them during that period of time. So the transition period between parliaments is usually when the standing orders, if there are any amendments around that time, are looked at so that when the new parliament comes in, now they are subject to those standing orders without there being any perception of some sort of bias or anything like that.
Ben, you mentioned that this is really a good process for integrity in terms of the outgoing government looking at standing orders if need be. Are there any other legal requirements on an outgoing government, an outgoing parliament rather, that they need to comply with before a new parliament comes in?
In terms of legal requirements, no, not really, because if you look at Section 104, it basically it tells you what a normal term of office is for a parliamentarian. And their term of office expires at the date set generally for the return of the writs. So in this instance, the return of the writs has been set at July 29th, was it? Is
yes,
that what you said?
July
29th?
Yep.
So July 29th. So what the Parliament will be looking at is to make sure that there's liaison between the Speaker, the Prime Minister and the Governor-General, Government House, to ensure that, and the Electoral Commissioner, to ensure that by that date, the majority, if not all, but at least the majority of the candidates have been declared, the members-elect. And I say that because in 2017 there was about 4 or 5 that I can remember that were not declared by that point in time. And so some carried on. One of the more notable ones would have been Honourable William Poe's election.
Yes, the Governor of Southern Highlands.
Yes. That was not until something like about a month later or something.
Sure. There must have been an inconvenience for the parliamentary service.
No, not necessarily. We just dealt with the majority, and then have to have them sworn in, and then when he arrived later, then he was sworn in by the Speaker. So we focus on getting ready for the incoming Parliament, for the election of the Speaker first up, and then the election of the Prime Minister, and then the induction period. Anything like what I would call late writs, they are then sworn in by the Speaker rather than the Chief Justice on the first day of Parliament. It really doesn't make too much difference other than the fact that they're not present at, say, the first opportunity to sit down in the chamber, if they're a new member.
And I think those processes are important, and we can also explore those in detail. But just on that question, so as per Section 104, then it would be taken that an MP at the issue of writs, that's the start of the election, is still an MP up till that return of writs point.
Correct.
That you mentioned.
Correct. They remain a member of Parliament up until the date for the return of the writs. The only difference is that there's two that will continue. They are the Prime Minister and the Speaker. They will continue until 12 midnight on the day before the Parliament is set to meet for the first time. The Parliament is supposed to meet for the first time under Section 124 of the Constitution within 7 days from the return of the writs. So we focus on having a date, and as I said, we liaise with the Prime Minister, the outgoing Prime Minister, outgoing Speaker, and the current Governor General, to make sure that the date is set, and then we work towards preparations for that date. And so we try to get some feel and an understanding maybe 2 weeks in advance of that, so that it helps us to prepare and organise the building and make sure there's fuel, and in case there's a blackout, or there's water in case there's no water, which is what we're facing right now. So
it's certainly a difficult exercise during a difficult period when all eyes are focused on the electoral conduct. The machinery of Parliament still needs to be there to ensure a smooth transition. And I think on that point, you mentioned about the MPs and the clear position that the Constitution outlines. In terms of cabinets, so these are MPs that also form cabinet or ministers in the government. Would you know what their status is as ministers during that period from the issue of writs to the return of writs?
In my experience, usually the what they would call a caretaker cabinet is the prerogative of the Prime Minister, and it would be those ministers that he deems, that he requires in order to have the country still running and right up until the return of the writs and the forming of the new government, and election of Speaker and election of Prime Minister. So that is something that is a prerogative of the Prime Minister, and usually done at the Prime Minister's department and Prime Ministerial level. So Parliament doesn't have too much say in that. We just assist the Speaker to continue his roles and responsibilities up until the final day, if he's not returned. Either way, he's still not the Speaker when he comes back. There has to be an election of a new Speaker, whether it is the incumbent or whether it is someone new.
And I think that's an important process. You mentioned the election of the Speaker and of the Prime Minister as well. So maybe we can also explore that. Once the return of writs happens and you have that 7-day period before the first sitting of Parliament, in your experience, what is
it's within the 7 days.
Within the 7 days.
Yeah.
What is the process of the first sitting of Parliament and the election of a Speaker or Prime Minister?
Yeah, all of that essentially is covered in the standing orders and the provisions within the Constitution. The first session of Parliament will be the swearing in. Members will make the declaration of office and the declaration of loyalty before the Chief Justice usually. And after that, the clerk will conduct the election of the Speaker. Once a Speaker is elected by the House, he will then be sworn in by the Governor General at Government House and then come in and formally assume his role as Speaker. He will then chair the Prime Minister's election. That is the usual process.
Normally, how long does this take? Is it a couple of days? Is it a week?
From my experience the Prime Minister has been voted on the same day. There is allowance made where if there is some issue that the period for the election of the Prime Minister within the standing orders itself, Standing Order 6, allows for that period to be moved to 3 days. But I've never seen it happen. The way our formation of government is, they're usually coming straight into Parliament are already organised. They know who's got the numbers, they know who's going to form government, they know who their candidate for Prime Minister is. There usually isn't any, going in, having any issues with that. They'll come in, they'll vote who the Prime Minister is, and we'll move forward from there. That's my understanding of what will happen.
Given this process really depends on the return of writs, of you said, as long as we have a majority returned in time for that first sitting of Parliament. I know that in 2017 there were issues with some of the writs returning. You mentioned Governor Poe's, which was out by a month. Not to prejudge the process as it happens, but given some of the concerns around the electoral preparations and as we go into these elections, if the worst case were to happen and we do not have maybe a return of all the writs in time for that first sitting of Parliament, what would be the implications of that on that process? Is that catered for, or would it need to be considered at this stage?
The electoral process comes under the guidance of the Electoral Commissioner. That process is done in collaboration with a lot of other government departments, including police and defence personnel when they're required to assist with that. So some regions, some electorates usually are okay. There's no problems in the returning of the writ. Obviously some are, but fingers crossed, and it has been going ever since I've been at Parliament, that we usually have the majority of the writs in by the date that the writs are supposed to be returned. So yeah, fingers crossed that it will be exactly the same or moving along the same lines. So I really don't see that there will be too much issues, in all seriousness. We all want a government. We all want members of Parliament to represent us. So we, in all fairness and all honesty, we believe the electoral process should be able to give us that member of Parliament for that electorate, and then we move on from there and have them sworn in so that they can do their constitutional duty.
And I think it's really good to hear that the Parliamentary Service is ready for those eventualities, and also there to uphold the trust, the public trust that citizens should have in these democratic processes as they happen. I think in the news recently we've read about this enactment of maybe 7 new electorates that we might see.
Yeah.
And are there any challenges that might face that that you foresee for this Parliament, in terms of maybe even down to the practical consideration of, are there enough seats to cater for in the Parliament, or are there any other processes that need to be implemented between this time and the return of writs to cater for new seats?
The government decision to enact or make the decision to have the 7 new seats is their prerogative. For the Parliamentary Service, it's just for us to make sure that, yes, there are sufficient seats, especially on the floor, to cater for that. And definitely there are. When the Parliament was built, that was built into that as well, to make sure that there is sufficient room for growth, knowing full well that as the country gets bigger, the more electorates, the more people, then per capita representation, you're going to need to break up bigger electorates to make them smaller as the numbers increase within that. So currently on the floor there's 130 seats. We have 111 members. You add another 7, that'll be 118. That gives us 12 seats that are available for future growth. In terms of the floor of the House, there's no issue. Office within the National Parliament, well, that's something for myself and the clerk and that to discuss, how we move the internal administration structure to create those offices. As you know, we weren't prepared for the 7, but now we have to. It's, that's part and parcel of it. So.
Thank you. And as we go towards the end of our episode and looking at maybe that period, as you mentioned, after the new parliament is convened and a new government is formed, you mentioned that induction process. Are there any key components of that you look at in terms of strengthening the integrity of the new government, or are there any particular, I wouldn't want to say modules, but components of that program that are geared towards that?
Well, we wouldn't be looking at the new government, we'd be looking at the new parliament.
Sorry, new parliament, yes.
So we would look at both sides of the house. Each member that comes in, it doesn't matter whether you've been there for 4 terms, 3 terms, 2 terms, or 1 term. In my understanding, my belief is that you never know too much, you never know anything. It would pay to come to the induction program, which runs for a week, as re-education for yourself, if you want to put it that way. But for those members that don't know their role or their functions as a member of parliament, we will have TIPNG, hopefully, NRI, we will have Ombudsman Commission, we'll have presentations from Department of Provincial Governments, local level governments. We'll have a whole week of programs tailored towards members of parliament, helping them to learn their roles and functions. And I hope they turn up for that, because it really is something for them to be able to learn on the way in. And if you miss it, you've just missed out on a fraction of what you could have learnt as you go in. But I hope they don't miss it. I really hope they're there.
Yeah, and I think it's something that we commend the National Parliament and Parliamentary Services for hosting. It's 2017 was definitely interesting, speaking to members of Parliament at the time about issues of corruption and good governance when TIPNG presented. But we also saw presentations by the Ombudsman Commission, IRC, a number of other key actors in terms of some of the decision making that will be taken on the floor of Parliament by our legislators. As we come towards the end of this episode, are there any other parts of this process of the elections that you see National Parliament playing a role in terms of strengthening the integrity of the electoral process and the outcomes?
The electoral process itself, we don't have too much involvement in it. The Parliamentary Service tries to stay as neutral as possible throughout every process. So, no, I don't see us having too much within the electoral process itself. We would stray well away from that. We will just prepare ourselves for the 11th Parliament, and hopefully everything runs smoothly for us.
And our last question on this episode is really the one we ask to all our guests. Given the immense amount of work you do and the challenges that are faced, but also the opportunities for contributing to the national development, what inspires you to continue doing what you do?
I don't know whether I really have any inspiration, but one of the things that I hope to achieve in my time there is to be able to pass on what I've learned to somebody else. We've got young staff that are up and coming, so we're trying to teach them as much as possible so that when we're no longer there, then they'll have an idea of how these processes run and they'll be able to do it. I'm happy that I have in the core team that I would call the core team, being the clerk, the 2 deputies and the first clerk assistant, well over 100 years of parliamentary experience. Some of us have nearly reached 30 years. A couple of us have reached over 30 years within the service. So with that kind of background, there's a lot of depth within us, but the depth going back into the junior ranks is what I'm more focused on, trying to teach those that are coming up the proper processes and procedures and assist them to understand that everything is not set in stone. that there are some things that we may need to re-look at over and over again, such as the standing orders, such as, production of manuals for each office, what that office does, how it can move forward, even within the ICT space as well, looking at the use of ICT within the parliamentary service. Upgrading the chamber is one of the core things that the clerk and the speaker are now looking at. Moving into, hopefully within the next, I don't know, it may not be while I'm there, but into a paperless chamber where we don't use ink, we don't use paper, but we can have electronic tablets or whatnot, that everything can be downloaded onto read-only files that members can look at, and that can be the format used as we trek forward, so that there's no cumbersome paper all over the place and just constantly throwing the rubbish away and costing us paper and ink as we trek along. But that would be something in the future that we could look towards. But anyway, that's what inspires me in essence, is my will to want to teach those coming behind me what I've learned, and hopefully they can carry it on.
Thank you so much, Mr. Richard Witchchurch, Deputy Clerk of National Parliament of Papua New Guinea. And I think that's an excellent note to end on. Thank you for coming on to the TIPNG VoteCast and sharing your insights with the National Parliament as we look towards the national elections and the formation of the 11th Parliament of Papua New Guinea. So thank you so much to your office and to the clerk, as well as the speaker, for supporting TIPNG and informing our listeners and viewers on the TIPNG VoteCast. This has been a 6th episode of the TIPNG VoteCast. Thank you for joining us. Please continue to like and subscribe, follow us on YouTube, and follow our hashtag TIPNG elections to keep up to date about the elections in Papua New Guinea. Thank you.
Thank you very much.